His wife died giving birth to the baby he begged her to have. Now Kendrick Yates is alone with 6 children. The oldest is 10, and she's cooking every meal with burned hands and silent tears. The baby screams through the night for a mother who will never come. His 8-year-old son sleeps with a knife because he thinks it's his job to guard the family. And someone is slaughtering his cattle one by one in the dark, bleeding him dry until he has nothing left. Then a woman arrives. A woman running from a dead husband's ghost and a brother-in-law who grips her wrist hard enough to leave fingerprints. She carries a forged letter of reference and a vial of laudanum she keeps just in case. She tells herself this is temporary, just a job, just wages. But the moment she picks up that screaming baby and the child goes silent against her chest, she knows she's already in too deep. And the letter hidden behind a window frame, the one his dead wife wrote before she died, it will shatter him and set him free. Welcome to Cowboy Dusk, where the sun sets slow over the frontier, and every story carries the heartbeat of the wild, wild West. If you live for tales of rugged love, broken heroes, and second chances written in dust and starlight, you're home. This story teaches us that real strength isn't a closed fist. It's an open hand reaching out when everything inside you wants to fight alone. And that the people who save us are often just as broken as we are. They've simply chosen to stop running. If this story hit you right in the chest, leave a like and tell me in the comments. Which moment broke you the most? Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to build a family from the pieces life left behind, and subscribe to Cowboy Dusk so you never miss a story that burns long after the last ember fades. Kendrick Yates had not slept in 3 days, and the last time he caught his reflection in a saloon window, the face staring back looked more like a dead man than a father of 6. The Silver Strike Saloon in Wilcox smelled the way it always did on a cold November night. Tobacco smoke and spilled whiskey, and the sour tang of men who had worked cattle all day and had no women at home to tell them they stank. Kendrick sat at the far end of the bar with a glass he had barely touched, staring at the grain of the wood like it held some answer to the question that had been eating him alive for 3 months. How does a man raise 6 children alone in a land that barely lets a man raise cattle? He was 34 years old. His hands were scarred from barbed wire and branding irons, and the 1,000 small violences of ranch life in the Arizona Territory. His jaw was hard set beneath a week of stubble, and his shoulders were broad enough to fill a door frame. By all appearances, he was the kind of man who could handle anything this country threw at him. But appearances, as Kendrick had learned, were liars. The trouble started with a drunk cowhand named Virgil Poole, 3 stools down, running his mouth to anyone who would listen. Virgil worked for one of the big outfits south of town and had a habit of talking loud when he had liquor in him. Somebody ought to take those Yates young'uns to the orphan home in Tucson, Virgil announced to the bar. He said it the way a man talks about the weather, like it was obvious, like it was nothing. Before the poor little bastards starved to death out there on that godforsaken ranch, heard the oldest girl is doing all the cooking, and she ain't but 10 years old. That's a crime is what it is. Kendrick did not remember standing up. He did not remember crossing the 3 stools between them. He remembered the sound his fist made against Virgil's nose, a wet crack like a green branch breaking, and the way the man's head snapped back and sent his hat spinning across the floor. He remembered the table going over and glasses shattering, and someone shouting his name and the feeling of blood on his knuckles that was not his own. Then a hand on his shoulder, firm, calm, the grip of a man who was used to controlling rooms. Easy now, Kendrick, easy. Harlan Briggs stood behind him in a black coat that cost more than most cowhands made in 3 months. He was 48 years old, with silver at his temples and a face that had been handsome once before patience and calculation had worn it into something harder. He owned the largest ranch in the Wilcox Basin, more cattle than any 2 men could count, and half the mortgages in town. When Briggs spoke, people in Wilcox listened, not because they liked him, because they owed him. Briggs guided Kendrick away from the mess with the easy authority of a man herding livestock. He bought 2 whiskeys and set one in front of Kendrick and waited while the bartender helped Virgil up and pressed a rag to his bleeding face. "You cannot keep doing this, Kendrick." Briggs sipped his drink. "The town talks. They see a man falling apart and they worry about those children. Can you blame them? I can handle my own. Can you?" Briggs tilted his head. The gesture was almost kind. "That land of yours. It's too much for one man with 6 mouths to feed. I've been meaning to talk to you about it. They'll give you a fair price. More than fair. You could start fresh somewhere easier. California, maybe. Think about the children." Kendrick looked at the man's smooth hands wrapped around the whiskey glass. Hands that had never pulled a calf in a blizzard. Hands that had never dug a grave in October ground so hard it broke the shovel. "My land is not for sale, Harlan. Not today. Not ever." Briggs smiled. His eyes did not. "Just think about it. The offer stands." He finished his drink and walked out. And Kendrick sat there in the wreckage of the fight, feeling the bruises already forming on his right hand, and wondering how much longer he could hold everything together before it all came apart. Sheriff Tom Morrison found him on the boardwalk afterward. Morrison was 52, thick around the middle with a gray mustache and the permanent expression of a man who wished he had chosen a different profession. He was decent enough. But decency, Kendrick had noticed, had a way of wilting when it came up against money and power. Morrison dipped a rag in the horse trough and handed it to Kendrick without a word. Kendrick pressed it against his knuckles. The cold water stung. "You keep this up, and I'll have to lock you in a cell," Morrison said. "And then what happens to those kids?" Kendrick said nothing. Morrison lowered his voice. "Listen, there is a woman staying at the Patterson boarding house. Came in on the stage 2 weeks back. Widow. Name is Willa Osborne. I have talked to her a couple times and she seems right. Knows about running a household, cooking, teaching, even some doctoring from what I hear. She's looking for work." Kendrick was quiet for a long moment. "I do not need charity. It is not charity. It is a job. You pay her wages, room and board. She takes care of the house and the children. You take care of the ranch." Morrison paused. "She is running from something, Kendrick. I can see it in her eyes. Seen it enough times to know. But she is decent, and you need decent right now more than you need perfect." Kendrick rode home as the first light broke over the Chiricahua peaks, painting the mountains in bands of copper and dusty rose. The air smelled of creosote and cold sand, and the particular emptiness that comes before dawn in the desert. His saddle creaked beneath him, and his horse moved with the slow patience of an animal that knew the way home better than the man on its back. He passed the south pasture without meaning to slow down, but something caught his eye and he reined up. 3 head of cattle lay dead near the creek bank. He could see them clearly in the growing light, dark shapes on the pale ground. No blood trail, no predator marks, no sign of disease. Just 3 good animals lying where they should not be, dead for no reason he could see. He filed it away in the back of his mind. Too tired to examine it now. Too many other fires burning. When he crested the last ridge and looked down at his ranch, the sound hit him before the sight did. Molly screaming from inside the house. That thin, high wail that meant she had been crying so long her voice was giving out. The house was a sprawling, single-story structure that had been well built once. Sarah had kept it shining. Window boxes with flowers. A swept porch. Curtains she had sewn herself from fabric she ordered special from Tucson. Now the window boxes were empty. The porch steps sagged. Something that might have been laundry hung on the line, stiff and gray, forgotten for days. Inside was worse. Rebecca stood at the stove, tears running down her face in silence. She had learned weeks ago that crying out loud made the little ones panic, so she wept without sound, a skill no 10-year-old girl should ever have to learn. There was a fresh burn on her wrist from the skillet. She was trying to make porridge, and it was scorched black in the pan, and the kitchen smelled like failure. James sat in the far corner with Kendrick's skinning knife laid across his bony knees. He was 8 years old, and he had appointed himself the night guard because he heard coyotes after dark and somebody had to protect the family. His eyes were flat and watchful in a way that reminded Kendrick of boys he had known in the war. Boys who had seen too much too young and had gone quiet inside. Martha and Michael, the 6-year-old twins, were under the kitchen table pulling each other's hair with a viciousness that came from somewhere deeper than sibling rivalry. They did not know how to say, "I am scared and I miss my mother," so they said it with their fists instead. Thomas was in the yard. He was 4. He was eating dirt. Molly was in her cradle, purple-faced, hoarse, reaching for someone who was not there. Kendrick stood in the doorway of his own home and felt something crack inside his chest. Not his heart. His heart had broken the night Sarah died. This was something else. This was the last thin wall between holding on and letting go. He closed his eyes and saw it again. The bedroom. The midwife's face going white, blood soaking through the sheets faster than anyone could stop it. Sarah's hand in his, squeezing, then trembling, then going still. And the baby, his son, tiny and blue and silent, and born dead into a world that did not care. Kendrick had wanted that baby, had begged God for another child even though Sarah was tired, even though 6 was enough, even though some part of him knew the risk. And Sarah had smiled and said yes because she loved him enough to give him anything he asked for. He had killed her with wanting. That was the truth he carried like a stone in his chest, and no amount of work or whiskey or fistfights could make it lighter. He looked at his hands, blood on them again. Different blood, but the same helplessness. He looked at his 6 children. 6 reasons to keep breathing. 6 reasons to swallow every ounce of pride he had left and ride back into town. Not to fight this time. To beg. Willa Osborne had changed her name once since leaving Kansas, and each time she signed the new one, she left another piece of herself on the road behind her. She stood before the small mirror in her room at the Patterson boarding house and studied the woman looking back. 30 years old. Auburn hair pulled back tight. Gray-green eyes that had learned to give nothing away. A face that was not beautiful in the way men noticed across a saloon, but strong. The kind of face that kept going when prettier faces gave up. She turned slightly and lifted the hem of her chemise, tracing the faded scar along her lower ribs. The night Edward threw her into the corner of the kitchen table. She had told the doctor it was a fall from a horse. She had told Mrs. Patterson the same thing. She had told so many lies over the years that she sometimes forgot which version she had given to whom. While dressing, she checked her small leather traveling case the way she did every morning. An inventory of survival. Cash, not much. A forged letter of reference written in a hand she had practiced until it looked nothing like her own. A small vial of laudanum she kept just in case, though she never specified in case of what. And at the bottom, folded small, a newspaper clipping from the Lawrence Daily Journal. The headline still made her stomach drop every time she read it. Osborne widow flees town amid suspicion. The article did not accuse her directly. It did not have to. The implication was enough. Edward Osborne dies of pneumonia. His wife leaves town within the month. The family raises questions. Neighbors whisper. And just like that, a woman who survived 5 years of hell becomes the villain of her own story. She folded the clipping back into the case and closed it. Downstairs, Mrs. Patterson was holding court at the breakfast table with 2 other boarders, a mining clerk and a traveling preacher. The conversation turned, as it often did in small towns, to other people's misery. "Have you heard about that Yates man?" Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "Those poor children, running wild like animals, up on that ranch. The oldest girl doing all the cooking, and she is just a child herself. Someone ought to do something." Willa ate her toast and said nothing. She had heard the name Yates before. The crazy widower on the hill. The man who had broken someone's nose in the saloon last night. The father who could not cope. She felt a pull of sympathy so strong it surprised her. She knew what it was to drown. She knew what it was to fail at the thing that mattered most. But she also knew what men were, what they could become behind closed doors when the world pressed too hard, and there was no one to witness. Getting close to a man meant danger. 5 years of marriage had taught her this, not as opinion, but as fact. So when the knock came at the front door, and Mrs. Patterson answered it, and returned with a look of raised eyebrows to say there was a man asking for her by name, Willa's first instinct was to reach for her traveling case. But she did not run. Not yet. She straightened her collar and went to the door. Kendrick Yates stood on the porch of the boarding house, and through Willa's eyes he was this: a big man, well over 6 feet, broad across the shoulders and chest, with hands that looked like they could crush walnuts. His knuckles were bruised purple and his eyes were bloodshot, and his clothes looked like he had slept in them for a week if he had slept at all. Her body reacted before her mind could intervene. She took 1 step back, a small step. Automatic. The way a horse shies from a snake it has not yet seen. She noticed his size, his rough hands, the way he filled the doorway. Her body remembered what big men with damaged hands could do. But then she watched him twist his hat in his fingers with a nervousness that did not match his size. She heard his voice crack when he said the word children. She saw the way his jaw worked when he fought back the emotion that was trying to climb out of his throat. And she recognized something. This was not aggression. This was desperation. She knew the difference. She had lived with both for 5 years. "Madam," he said, "my name is Kendrick Yates. I have a ranch south of town. I have 6 children and no wife, and I am drowning. I need someone who can help me keep my family together. Someone who can cook and clean and teach and care for them. I can pay wages. Not much, but fair. Room and board included. Your own room. Sheriff Morrison said you might be looking for work and that you were decent. That is the word he used. Decent." He stopped. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on a man's face in a very long time. It took her a moment to name it: honesty. She set her conditions plainly. First, the children's welfare comes before everything, including ranch work. Second, if she sets a rule, he backs her up. Third, a budget for household expenses with the authority to manage it. Fourth, 1 day off per week. Fifth, clear boundaries. He agreed to all of them on the spot, and Willa added a 6th condition in her own mind that she did not speak aloud. She would watch. She would observe how this man behaved with his children before she committed to anything. If she saw any sign of violence, a raised hand, a too hard grip, a flash of rage directed downward at someone small, she would be gone before sunrise. She had done this before. She was very good at disappearing. They rode out to the ranch in his wagon. The house was worse than she expected and better than she feared. The chaos inside was real. Rebecca at the stove with tears and a burn. James in the corner with a knife. The twins fighting. Thomas eating dirt. Molly screaming. But then the moment that mattered. Thomas tripped coming up the porch steps. He fell hard on his knees and wailed, that full-throated scream of a 4-year-old who believes he is dying. Willa watched Kendrick. He dropped to 1 knee. He brushed the dirt from Thomas's scraped palms. He said softly, "You are all right, son. Breathe." His hands, those big, bruised, dangerous-looking hands, they were gentle, careful. They touched his son the way you touch something precious. Willa exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. This man was not Edward. This man was drowning, not dangerous. She stepped inside the kitchen. She pulled off her gloves. She lifted Molly from the filthy cradle and felt the baby's desperate fingers grip her collar. The child stopped screaming almost instantly, burying her face against Willa's neck with a shudder that went through her whole tiny body. Willa told herself this was temporary. Just a job, just wages, just a roof until she saved enough to keep moving west, somewhere the Osborne family would never find her. But when Molly stopped crying and looked up at her with blue eyes full of blind, immediate trust, something cracked in the wall Willa had spent a year building around her heart, and cracks she knew from long experience only ever got wider. On the third morning, Rebecca Yates looked Willa straight in the eye and said, "You are not my mother, and do not you ever think you can be." The words came out hard and flat, like stones dropped on a wooden floor. Rebecca stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and her chin lifted, and her mother's dark eyes burning with a fury that was really just grief wearing a mask. She was 10 years old, and she had been doing a woman's work for 3 months, and she had the blistered hands and dark circles to prove it. She had earned her place in this kitchen with burned fingers and sleepless nights, and tears shed in private. And now this stranger had walked in and started giving orders and organizing shelves and cooking meals that actually tasted right. And it made Rebecca want to scream. Because if this woman could do what Mama did, then maybe Mama was replaceable. And if Mama was replaceable, then maybe love was too. Maybe nothing was permanent. Maybe the whole world was just people leaving. She could not put any of this into words. She was 10. So she stood in the doorway and said the hardest thing she could think of, and waited for Willa to react the way adults always reacted, with anger or dismissal or that terrible pitying look that made Rebecca feel small. Willa did not react at all, at least not in the way Rebecca expected. She set down the pot she was scrubbing and dried her hands on her apron and looked at Rebecca with an expression that was neither angry nor pitying. It was something else, something steady. "You are right," Willa said quietly. "I am not your mother." Then she went back to scrubbing the pot, and Rebecca stood there feeling cheated out of the fight she had been looking for. Over the next few days, Rebecca's campaign continued. It was subtle in the way only a clever child can manage. She accidentally knocked over the soup pot that Willa had been simmering for hours. She forgot to tell the twins that bath time had been moved to before supper. She whispered to Martha and Michael at bedtime in a voice just loud enough to carry, "She will leave. Everybody leaves." Willa heard it. She heard it through the thin wall of the sewing room that served as her bedroom, lying in the dark with a paring knife under her pillow, and the words hit her harder than they should have because part of her believed they were true. She waited for the right moment. It came on a late afternoon when the younger children were napping, and James had gone with Kendrick to check fence line, and the house was quiet in that rare desert way where you can hear the wind moving through the canyon a mile off. Willa found Rebecca sitting on the porch steps, staring at nothing. She sat down beside her. Not too close, close enough to talk, far enough to respect the wall. "I am not trying to replace your mother, Rebecca. Nobody can do that. She was yours and she always will be. I am just here to help, and if you ever want to tell me about her, I would like to listen." Rebecca said nothing. Her jaw was tight and her eyes were fixed on the horizon where the Chiricahua Mountains turned purple in the late light. But she did not get up. She did not leave the porch. It was not much, but it was a start, the first small fracture in the wall. Out on the south fence line that same afternoon, Kendrick and James rode the boundary of the ranch in the kind of silence that settles between a father and son who have both forgotten how to talk. James was 8. He rode a spotted pony named Biscuit, and he sat the saddle the way his father had taught him, straight-backed and easy, moving with the horse. He had his father's jaw and his mother's quiet eyes. And lately he had taken to copying Kendrick's worst habit, sealing himself behind a wall of silence and pretending the world could not touch him there. They came upon the dead cattle at the South Creek crossing. 2 more, both lying on their sides near the water. Kendrick dismounted and walked to the nearest one and dropped to his haunches. The cuts were on the throat, clean and deliberate, made by a sharp knife wielded by someone who knew how to handle one. He traced the wound with his fingers, feeling the smoothness of the slice, and his stomach went cold. This was not predators. It was not disease. Someone was coming onto his land and slaughtering his stock, 1 or 2 at a time, slow enough to look like bad luck, deliberate enough to bleed him dry. He looked up toward the far ridge where the Briggs Ranch sat against the skyline like a dark crown on the hill. He had no proof, nothing he could take to the sheriff that would not sound like the raving of a desperate man looking for someone to blame. "Pa," James said from atop his pony. His voice was careful, the way it got when he was worried but did not want to show it. "That is 5 dead this week." "I know, son. Is someone doing this to us?" Kendrick looked at his boy. 8 years old, sitting straight in the saddle with eyes too old for his face. He thought about lying. He thought about saying it was just bad luck, just nature, just the way things went sometimes in cattle country. But James had his mother's ability to spot a lie, and Kendrick respected him too much to try. "I think so," he said. "But I do not know who yet." They rode home in silence, and the 5 dead cattle lay behind them in the fading light, like an unsigned letter. That evening, Kendrick sat at the kitchen table while Willa wrote out a supply list by lamplight. Her handwriting was neat and precise, and she moved the pencil with the same efficiency she brought to everything. No wasted motion, no hesitation. She had been here 3 days, and already the house felt different, not fixed, not healed, but steadier, like a building that had been given a new foundation post before the whole thing could collapse. The children were in bed. The house was quiet except for the scratch of pencil on paper and the tick of the mantel clock Sarah had brought from her parents' home in Virginia. Kendrick sat across from Willa, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Then he said simply, "Thank you." Willa looked up. She nodded. That was all. No speeches, no promises. Just a man saying thank you and a woman accepting it, and the silence between them that was not empty anymore but shared. Later that night, after Kendrick had gone to bed, Willa made her rounds. She checked the window latch in the front room, the back door, the kitchen door. She tested each one with her fingers, feeling for the solidity of the bolt, the snugness of the fit. Then she went to her room and slid a paring knife under her pillow and lay in the dark listening to the house settle around her. Old habits. The habits of a woman who had spent 5 years sleeping with one ear open, waiting for the sound of boots on the floorboards and whiskey on a man's breath. She wondered sometimes how long it would take before her body stopped expecting to be hit, whether there was a number of safe nights that would add up to a feeling of safety, whether such a number even existed. She listened to the wind outside and the distant yip of coyotes in the canyon, and the small, soft sound of Molly sighing in her sleep in the next room. And she thought, "This is not my home. These are not my children. This is temporary." But the thought rang false in a way she could not quite explain, like a bell with a crack in it. Next morning, Kendrick found 2 more cattle dead at the South Spring, and this time the cuts were so clean and deliberate they might as well have been a signature. Harlan Briggs sat on the porch of the biggest house in the Wilcox Basin, swirling bourbon that cost more than most men earned in a week, and said to Silas Cobb, 3 more weeks, no more. Then Yates crawls to me on his knees. Cobb leaned against the porch rail and said nothing. He was 35, lean as a strip of jerky, with a face that looked like it had been carved from desert rock by someone who did not care about symmetry. He had served 4 years in the Yuma Territorial Prison for cattle rustling, and had come out the other side quieter and meaner and entirely without illusions about the goodness of men. He worked for Briggs because Briggs paid well, and because the alternative was going back to Yuma, which he would sooner die than do. "Keep varying the method," Briggs said, some throats cut, some poisoned at the water, "and start talking in town about sickness in the Yates herd. If nobody will buy his beef, his credit dries up. The store stops extending him supplies. Then the bank comes calling on his mortgage." "What about the woman?" Cobb said. "Heard he hired some housekeeper." Briggs waved a hand. "One more mouth to feed. One more expense he cannot afford. She will be gone inside a month." Cobb nodded and left, his boots quiet on the porch boards, and Briggs sat alone with his bourbon and watched the sun go down over the valley he intended to own entirely before the year was out. After a while he went inside. The house was enormous. 8 rooms built for a family that no longer existed within its walls. His wife had died of fever 12 years ago. His son Garrett had left for San Francisco 5 years after that, and Briggs had not received a single letter since. Not one word in 5 years from the boy he had built all of this for. He stopped before the daguerreotype on the mantel, a young man maybe 20 with Briggs's jawline and his dead wife's eyes. Garrett. Somewhere in California, living a life that had nothing to do with cattle or water rights or the slow accumulation of desert land. Briggs poured another bourbon and drank it standing in the dark parlor, and the house creaked around him like a ship with no crew and no destination. And he did not speak, because there was no one to speak to. Kendrick rode into Wilcox the next morning with the supply list Willa had written, and a determination to hold things together for one more day. The town was small, a main street of sun-bleached buildings and boardwalks and hitching posts, backed up against the railroad tracks that had brought the town into existence, and might someday carry it into irrelevance. His first stop was the sheriff's office. Morrison listened to his report about the dead cattle with the particular attentiveness of a man who already knows what you are going to say and is preparing his excuses in advance. He took notes. He avoided eye contact. Could be Apache, Morrison offered. Could be wolves. Wolves do not use knives, Tom. Morrison flinched. He set down his pencil and rubbed his face and for a moment looked every one of his 52 years. I will look into it, Kendrick. That is all I can promise. Kendrick stared at him. You know something you are not telling me. I said I will look into it. At the general store, things got worse. Leland Marsh, the storekeeper, was a thin man with spectacles and a careful manner who had always been friendly enough. Today he stood behind his counter with the look of someone about to deliver bad news and wishing he were anywhere else. Kendrick, he said, and then stopped. He adjusted his spectacles. He tried again. I have been hearing things about your herd. Sickness, they are saying. I do not want to cut off your credit, truly I do not. But I have got to think about my own situation. If your beef is tainted and people find out I have been extending you credit on the strength of that herd, well, he trailed off. My beef is not tainted, Kendrick said. His voice was steady, but his hands gripped the counter edge hard enough to whiten his knuckles. Someone is killing my cattle, Leland, cutting their throats in the night. And now someone is spreading lies about disease. Think about who benefits from that. Think about who has been trying to buy my land. Marsh looked uncomfortable, but did not budge. I am sorry, Kendrick. I need to see proof that your herd is healthy before I can extend more credit. Come back with a letter from the stock inspector and we will talk. Kendrick walked out of the store with none of the supplies on Willa's list, and a cold feeling spreading through his chest. The financial noose was tightening. Whoever was behind this, and he was more certain by the hour that it was Briggs, was not just killing his cattle. They were killing his livelihood, his reputation, his ability to feed his children. He rode home with an empty wagon and a heavy heart. But the ranch he returned to was not the same ranch he had left that morning. Not quite. Something had changed in the 3 hours he had been gone. Willa had set the twins to work. Martha and Michael stood at the kitchen table with flour on their faces and dough on their hands, kneading bread under Willa's patient instruction. Their small fists punched and folded and punched again. And when Kendrick walked in, they held up their first loaf with the kind of fierce pride that only a 6-year-old can muster. We made bread, Papa, Martha announced. Mrs. Osborne showed us how. Michael held up his loaf, which was lopsided and slightly burned on one end. I did the punching part. Kendrick looked at the bread. He looked at his twins, flour-dusted and grinning, and something in his chest loosened just a fraction. He tore off a piece and ate it and told them it was the finest bread he had ever tasted, and it was not even much of a lie. Behind the twins, Willa caught his eye. She saw the empty wagon through the window. She saw his face. She asked no questions, but he could tell she understood that the supply run had not gone well. It was early December now, and Willa turned her attention to the approaching holiday. There was no money for real presents, and she did not pretend otherwise. Instead, she taught the children to make decorations from what the land and the house could provide. Pine cones gathered from the canyon and tied with scraps of calico. Popcorn strings made on long winter evenings by the stove. Paper chains from old newspapers. She taught James to carve. The boy had been hovering at the edges since she arrived, watchful and silent, mimicking his father's habit of hiding behind a wall of quiet. But when Willa showed him how to use a small knife to shape a piece of scrap wood into a horse, something opened in his face. His hands had a natural steadiness, a patience that belied his age, and the horse he produced after 2 evenings of work was surprisingly good. He held it up and almost smiled, and Willa told him it was beautiful, and this time James did not look away. It was on one of those December evenings that the thing happened that Willa could not explain away and could not forget. Kendrick had ridden into town to meet with a cattle buyer, a man named Prescott from Tucson, who might be willing to purchase a dozen head if the price was low enough. The meeting ran late. Prescott bought 2 rounds of whiskey to grease the negotiation, and Kendrick drank them because refusing felt like weakness, and he could not afford to appear weak. Not now. He came home after dark. The children were in bed. Willa was at the kitchen table mending one of Thomas's shirts by lamplight. When Kendrick walked in, the smell came with him. Whiskey. Not strong, not sloppy, but there. On his coat, on his breath, in the air around him. Willa froze. It was not a conscious thing. It was not a decision. It was her body remembering before her mind could intervene. Her hand moved toward the knife block on the counter. Her spine went rigid. Her eyes went somewhere far away and terrible, somewhere that smelled like a kitchen in Kansas where a man's footsteps on the floor meant pain was coming. Kendrick saw it immediately. The stillness. The way her body coiled. The distance in her eyes that was not thought but memory, not anger but pure, practiced fear. "Willa?" He stopped in the doorway. His voice went soft. "I only had 2 drinks." "Are you all right?" She snapped back. Her hand dropped from the knife block. Her spine unlocked. But her eyes, when they met his, still held the ghost of wherever she had just been. "Do not bring that smell into this house," she said. "Please." Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. Kendrick did not understand. Not yet. But he recognized fear when he saw it. Real fear, the kind that lives in the bones and does not answer to reason. And he nodded. He never drank before coming home again. 2 days before Christmas, Willa was tidying the sewing room that served as her bedroom when she found something that stopped her cold. A scrap of pale blue fabric with tiny white flowers folded into the back of a drawer. She recognized the pattern. She had seen it in the photograph on the mantel, the one of Sarah Yates in her Sunday dress, smiling with a baby on her hip. Willa had already cut a piece of similar fabric from the same drawer to patch a tear in Thomas's shirt. She had not realized what it was. She had not known. Rebecca did know. The girl appeared in the doorway like a small, avenging spirit, her face white with fury. "That was Mama's dress," she said. Her voice shook. "How dare you cut it up? How dare you touch her things?" Willa did not defend herself. She did not explain or justify or apologize. Instead, she reached into the drawer and pulled out the remaining fabric. She held it up so Rebecca could see. "You are right," she said quietly. "I should have asked. I did not know what it was when I used it. But look, I kept this part." She turned the fabric to show the corner where delicate embroidered initials read S.Y., Sarah Yates. "I was going to sew it into a handkerchief for you, so you could always carry a piece of her with you. But if you do not want me to, I will stitch the dress back together as best I can." Rebecca stared at the initials. Her lips trembled. The anger drained from her face like water from a cracked cup. And what was left underneath was just grief. Raw and ragged, and too big for a 10-year-old body to hold. She broke. The dam cracked and the tears came. Not the silent tears she had taught herself to cry, but real ones, loud and ugly and wrenching. She cried for her mother. She cried for the dress. She cried for the 3 months of pretending she was fine when she was not fine at all and never had been. Willa gathered her in. She held Rebecca against her chest and let the girls sob until the sobs turned to shudders, and the shudders turned to hiccups, and the hiccups turned to a shaky, exhausted quiet. "Tell me about her," Willa said softly. "Tell me about your mama." And Rebecca did. She talked for an hour, sitting on the floor of the sewing room with her head on Willa's shoulder, telling stories about Sarah Yates that ranged from the funny to the heartbreaking. The pie she burned on Thanksgiving, the way she sang off-key when she hung laundry, the night she sat up with James when he had the croup, singing and rocking until dawn. Willa listened to every word. She did not change the subject. She did not look uncomfortable. She held Rebecca and listened, and when the girl finally ran out of words and fell asleep with her head in Willa's lap, Willa sat very still in the growing dark and thought about what it meant to be trusted with someone's grief. 2 days after Christmas, a stranger rode up to the ranch on a bay horse. He was clean-shaven and well-dressed, and he sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. He reined up at the porch and removed his hat and smiled, and the smile was charming and practiced and did not reach his eyes. He asked for Mrs. Willa Osborne by name, said he had come all the way from Kansas. Willa was in the kitchen when she heard the voice. She walked to the window and looked out, and the color drained from her face so fast that Kendrick, standing at the sink, thought she might faint. In the year he had known his first wife die, in the months of watching his world fall apart, he had never once seen Sarah look that afraid. But Willa looked afraid now, afraid in a way that came from somewhere deep and old and practiced, afraid in a way that had nothing to do with the present and everything to do with the past. And Kendrick's hand moved instinctively to the rifle above the door. The man introduced himself as Caleb Osborne, Edward's younger brother, and his smile was so much like her dead husband's that Willa tasted bile at the back of her throat. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hand and his coat brushed clean, and his boots polished to a shine that looked wrong in the dust of an Arizona cattle ranch. He was 28, younger than Edward had been, with the same sandy hair and the same quick-shifting eyes that could switch from friendly to something else between one heartbeat and the next. "Willa," he said, and the familiarity of her first name on his lips made her skin crawl. "The family has been worried sick about you. You just disappeared. No word, no letter. Ma has been beside herself." Kendrick stood behind Willa in the kitchen doorway, his hand no longer on the rifle, but his body positioned the way a man stands when he is ready to move fast. He watched the stranger with the flat assessment of someone who has survived a war and learned to read danger in the way a man holds his shoulders. Willa forced her voice steady. "Caleb, I did not expect you." "Well, that is the thing about family," Caleb said. "We show up whether you expect us or not." His smile widened. "Are you going to introduce me to your employer?" The word employer carried a weight that only Willa could hear, a reminder of her position. A reminder that she was the hired help in another man's home, with no real claim to protection or belonging. Kendrick stepped forward. "Kendrick Yates, this is my ranch. What brings you to Arizona, Mr. Osborne?" "Family business," Caleb said lightly. "Just need a few minutes with my sister-in-law, if you do not mind." Kendrick looked at Willa. She gave a small nod that cost her more than he knew, and he went inside, though he did not go far. Willa could feel him on the other side of the kitchen window, listening. The moment they were alone, Caleb's smile changed. It did not disappear. It sharpened, the way Edward's smile used to sharpen right before the first blow. "You have made yourself hard to find, Willa." That was the idea. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "Edward's life insurance policy, $500. You are the sole beneficiary, you know that. The paperwork has been sitting in the insurance office in Lawrence for 8 months, waiting for your signature. I am aware." Caleb stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his shaving soap and the faint undertone of whiskey that seemed to be a family trait. "All you need to do is sign a transfer of rights. The money goes to the family. To Ma, who is old and sick and needs care. You sign, I ride away, and you never hear from any of us again." Willa held his gaze. She had learned long ago that looking away was an invitation. "What if I do not sign?" The smile vanished. In its place was something that looked very much like Edward on a bad night. "Then I'd tell your nice rancher friend everything." He took another step. "Including the version I want to tell, the one where you poisoned my brother." His hand shot out and gripped her wrist. Not a grab, but a squeeze, deliberate and controlled, his fingers pressing into the thin skin over the bones with practiced precision. The kind of grip that left bruises shaped like fingerprints. The kind of grip that said, I know exactly how much this hurts, and I'm choosing to do it anyway. Willa did not flinch. She had been trained not to flinch by an expert. She looked at his hand on her wrist, and then she looked at his face, and she said in a voice so flat it could have been used to level a floor, "Take your hand off me, Caleb, or I will scream, and the man inside that kitchen will come out here, and you will wish I had just signed your paper." Caleb released her wrist. The charming smile returned as if it had never left. "Think about it, Willa. I am staying at the saloon in town. I will give you a few days, but my patience has limits, just like Edward's did." He mounted his horse and rode back toward Wilcox, and Willa stood on the porch and watched him go, and did not move until the dust from his horse settled, and the sound of hooves faded, and the desert was quiet again. Then she went inside and walked past Kendrick without meeting his eyes, and locked herself in the sewing room, and sat on the edge of the bed, and pressed her palms together to keep them from shaking. $500. It was a fortune. It could pay off Kendrick's debts, restock the pantry for a year, buy new breeding stock to replace the cattle that kept dying. She was already thinking of this family's survival, not just her own, and the realization startled her. She would not sign. The money was hers, legally and morally. Edward had beaten her for 5 years and drunk himself into an early grave, and the least the universe owed her was $500. But Caleb would not stop. She knew the Osborne family the way a rabbit knows the hawk. They did not give up, did not give. They did not go away. They just circled and circled until they found the opening. That night, after the house was dark and the children were asleep and Kendrick had finally stopped hovering outside her door and gone to bed, Willa sat at the kitchen table by the light of a single candle and wrote 2 letters. The first was addressed to Dr. Samuel Phelps in Lawrence, Kansas. He was the physician who had treated Edward during his final illness. He had examined the body. He had signed the death certificate. He knew that Edward Osborne died of pneumonia compounded by chronic alcoholism and liver failure, and he knew that there was no poison involved. Willa wrote carefully, explaining her situation, asking him to send a signed copy of the death certificate and any medical deposition he could provide regarding the cause of death. The second letter was addressed to the Shawnee County Records Office, requesting a certified copy of Edward's life insurance policy and any associated claim documents. She sealed both letters and hid them in her trunk beneath her spare dress. She would post them tomorrow when she went to town. She told no one, because she had spent her whole life learning that the only person she could truly rely on was herself. In the Silver Strike Saloon that same night, Caleb Osborne sat at the bar and drank whiskey, and mentioned to the bartender that he was in town looking for his sister-in-law. Just family business, nothing dramatic. 2 stools down, a man in a black coat listened without appearing to listen. Harlan Briggs had not become the richest man in the Wilcox Basin by ignoring useful information. He bought Caleb a drink, then another. Within an hour, the 2 men had recognized in each other the particular kind of usefulness that comes from having complementary goals. Briggs wanted Kendrick broken. Caleb wanted Willa cornered. If Caleb drove Willa away, Kendrick would collapse. If Briggs pressured Kendrick, Willa would become more isolated and desperate. They did not shake hands. Men like Briggs and Caleb did not need to. They understood each other the way wolves understood each other, instinctively, with a shared vocabulary of appetite and patience. Back at the ranch, Kendrick lay in his bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what he had seen on the porch that afternoon. The way Willa's face went white, the way her body went still, the way she looked at the stranger from Kansas, the way a deer looks at a rifle. He asked her about it the next day. "Who is that man, Willa?" she answered without looking up from the dishes. "In-law. Family business." He did not believe her. But he respected the boundary because he understood better than most that some truths had to be offered freely. They could not be taken. 3 days later, he found her behind the barn at dusk. She was crying. She wiped her face when she saw him, but not fast enough, and not before he saw the bruises on her wrist. 5 fingerprints, fresh and dark. in a pattern no accident could make. Kendrick Yates had killed a man exactly once in his life. 1863 at Chickamauga, when he was 16 years old and shaking so badly he could barely aim. The Confederate boy across from him had been about the same age, and for one frozen second they had looked at each other with identical expressions of terror, before Kendrick's rifle fired and the other boy fell. He had sworn that night, on his knees in the mud with gun smoke in his lungs and another boy's blood on his hands, that he would never kill again. But looking at the bruises on Willa's wrist, shaped like the fingers of a man who had gripped her with deliberate force, Kendrick felt that 20-year-old oath begin to crack. He did not charge into town. He did not reach for his gun. He did something harder. He walked to where Willa stood behind the barn with her back against the weathered boards and her arms wrapped around herself, and he knelt in front of her the way he had knelt beside Thomas on the porch steps that first day, slowly, carefully, making himself smaller. He reached for her wrist. She flinched. He waited. Then he took it gently, turning it so the bruises caught the last of the light. And he said, "Who did this?" Willa pulled away. Not hard. Not panicked, but her eyes went wary, the way a horse's eyes go wary when it has been handled rough and does not know yet if the new hand will be kind or cruel. Kendrick did not grab back. He waited. Then he said, "I am not a man who hurts women, Willa, but I need to know who does so I can keep you safe." The silence stretched between them. A hawk circled overhead. The wind moved through the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and coming rain. Inside the house, one of the twins laughed at something, and the sound was so normal, so ordinary, that it made the moment outside feel like it belonged to a different world entirely. Then Willa told him. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. Edward drank. Edward hit me. For 5 years, every week, sometimes every day. He broke my wrist once, cracked 2 ribs. I learned to treat my own injuries because going to the doctor meant explaining, and explaining meant admitting, and admitting meant the whole world would know I was the kind of woman who stayed with a man who hurt her. She said it flatly, without self-pity, the way you describe weather. Kendrick listened without interrupting. He died of pneumonia and whiskey. There was no poison. But his family needed someone to blame, and I was convenient. His brother Caleb is the same kind of man Edward was. He wants money, an insurance policy, and he will destroy my reputation to get it. She paused. I should have told you from the start, but I was afraid you would send me away if you knew I was bringing trouble to your door. She waited. She waited the way she had waited 100 times before, for the anger, the blame, the door closing. The way men always responded when the mess got too complicated and the cost of caring got too high. Kendrick was quiet for a long beat. Then he said, Caleb Osborne sets foot on my property again. He will wish he had not. And you're not going anywhere, Willa. This is your home. He said it plainly, like stating the weather. No drama, no grand gesture, just fact. And Willa, who had not felt safe in years, felt something shift beneath her ribs. Something that had been clenched tight for so long she had forgotten it was there. It did not release all at once, but it loosened, just a fraction, just enough to let her breathe. That night, the storm came. It swept down from the mountains without warning, a January cold snap that had no business being in southern Arizona. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 2 hours. The wind came howling through the valley like something alive and angry, rattling the windows and tearing at the roof, and driving sheets of sleet sideways through the dark. Kendrick was in bed when he smelled the smoke. He was on his feet before the thought fully formed, pulling on boots and grabbing his coat and slamming through the back door into the screaming wind. The cattle barn was on fire. Flames climbed the east wall in great orange tongues that licked at the roof beams and sent sparks spiraling into the black sky. The cattle inside were bellowing, a sound of pure animal terror that carried even above the storm. James appeared beside him, barefoot and wild-eyed, and Kendrick shouted at the boy to go back inside, but James was already running toward the barn, because he was 8 years old and brave and stupid in the way that only the young can be. Willa came out next. She took one look at the fire and turned to the children crowding the back door. "Rebecca, take Molly and Thomas to the root cellar. Stay there until I come for you. Martha, Michael, come with me. We need water." She organized the twins into a bucket brigade from the well to the barn with a speed and efficiency that would have impressed a military officer. 6-year-olds hauling buckets that were too heavy for them, sloshing water across the yard, faces orange in the firelight, not crying because Willa had told them not to cry, and somehow that was enough. Kendrick kicked open the barn door, and a wall of heat hit him like a fist. He plunged inside, pulling his coat over his mouth, and began driving cattle toward the opening. The animals were crazed with fear, slamming into walls, trampling each other. A burning beam crashed down 3 feet from where he stood and showered him with sparks. He felt fire bite his forearm and ignored it. James had gotten the horse stalls open. The horses were smarter than the cattle, bolting for the door the moment it was clear, and James dodged their hooves with the agility of a boy who had grown up around livestock. Willa appeared at the barn door and grabbed the gate that penned the cattle corral. The metal latch was hot enough to sear, and she felt it burn her palm as she wrenched it open. But she did not let go. She held the gate wide while Kendrick drove the remaining cattle through, slapping their flanks, shouting, coughing from the smoke. They saved most of the stock. Not all. 8 head of cattle dead, trapped in the far pen where the fire had started. The barn itself was half destroyed, the east wall and part of the roof gone, the rest blackened and steaming. They stood in the yard as the storm finally broke, cold rain driving the last of the flames into hissing submission, and took stock. Kendrick had a burn on his forearm that was already blistering. James's feet were cut from running barefoot on frozen ground. The twins were soaked and shivering, and Willa stood among them with her burned palm pressed against her apron, not mentioning it, not drawing attention, just breathing. Inside, with the children dried and warmed and finally asleep in a pile of blankets in the front room, Kendrick sat at the kitchen table while Willa cleaned his burn. She worked by lamplight, her hands steady and precise, applying salve and wrapping clean cloth around his forearm with the practiced skill of someone who had tended many wounds. He noticed her hand, the burn across her palm, angry and red, from the hot gate latch. "You are hurt," he said. "It is nothing. Let me see." She hesitated. Then she extended her hand. He took it carefully, and she did not pull away. He got the salve and applied it himself, slowly, his rough, calloused fingers impossibly gentle against her damaged skin. He wrapped a clean strip of cloth around her palm and tied it off. And when he finished, he did not let go of her hand. The air between them changed. It had been changing for weeks in small increments, in shared silences, and glances held a beat too long, and the particular electricity that builds between two people who are falling toward each other but are too afraid or too honorable or too broken to close the distance. He looked up. She looked back. The lamplight caught the auburn in her hair and the gray-green of her eyes, and for one long suspended moment the world contracted to the space between them. Then Molly cried from the next room, and the moment shattered like glass, and Willa pulled her hand free and stood up and went to tend the baby, and Kendrick sat at the table and pressed his palms flat against the wood and felt his heart hammering and thought, "I am in trouble." Next morning, James found the brass button. They were clearing debris from the burned section of the barn, shoveling ash and charred wood into a pile, when the boy's sharp eyes caught a glint of metal. He picked it up and brushed it clean. A coat button, brass, distinctive. The kind with a raised pattern around the edge that was custom-made by the tailor in Wilcox, a man named Henshaw, who was particular about his work and did not use catalog buttons. "Pa," James said, holding it up. Kendrick took the button and turned it in his fingers. He had seen this button before. He had seen it 3 days ago, on the coat of a lean, quiet man leaning against Harlan Briggs's porch rail. Silas Cobb. He pocketed the button and looked toward the Briggs Ranch on the far ridge. He had his proof now. What he did with it would determine whether his family survived or burned along with everything else. The Colt .45 on Kendrick's hip felt heavier than it had in 20 years, heavier than it had at Chickamauga, heavier than the night he buried Sarah. And yet his hand kept drifting to it like a compass needle finding north. He saddled his horse in the cold gray light before dawn. The burn on his forearm throbbed under the bandage Willa had wrapped the night before. His jaw was set in a line that would have been familiar to any man who had served with him during the war, the look of a man who had moved past thinking and into action, and action in Kendrick's experience usually meant violence. He had told Willa he was riding to check the south fence. He had not told her about the brass button in his pocket, or the Colt on his hip, or the cold, clean fury that had been building in his chest since the moment he had seen the bruises on her wrist. Someone was killing his cattle. Someone had burned his barn. Someone had put their hands on the woman he was falling in love with. And Kendrick Yates, who had been drowning for 3 months in grief and helplessness, finally had a target for his rage. He did not notice James following on his spotted pony until it was too late. The Briggs Ranch sat on the high ground north of town, a spread of corrals and outbuildings surrounding a house that looked like it belonged in San Francisco rather than the Arizona desert. Kendrick tied his horse at the gate and walked into the stable yard, his boots crunching on frozen ground, his hand on the butt of the Colt. Silas Cobb was there. Brushing down a horse in the open stable, his lean frame bent to the work, his distinctive coat hanging on a nail nearby. Kendrick noticed the coat immediately, the brass buttons running down the front, one of them missing. He pulled the button from his pocket and held it up. "Lost something, Cobb?" Cobb straightened slowly. His hand drifted toward his own belt, but Kendrick was faster. The Colt cleared leather and leveled at Cobb's chest before the other man's fingers reached his holster. "You set that fire," Kendrick said. His voice was quiet and flat. "You have been killing my cattle for weeks, cutting their throats, poisoning the water, all on Briggs's dime, and I have got the proof right here." He held up the brass button. Cobb's eyes flicked to it and then back to the gun, and his face went through a rapid series of calculations that ended with a sneer. "That does not prove anything. Could be anyone's button. It is from Henshaw's shop. Same as the ones on your coat. Same pattern, same brass. You lost it in my barn while you were burning it down. So what are you going to do about it, Yates? Shoot me? In Briggs's own yard? That will go well for you." Kendrick grabbed Cobb by the collar with his free hand and shoved the Colt under his chin. The metal pressed into the soft flesh of the man's throat, and Cobb went very still. His sneer faded. "Give me one reason I should not scatter what is left of your brains across this yard," Kendrick said. He meant it. In that moment, with the weight of 3 months of loss and rage and helplessness pressing down on him, with the memory of dead cattle and a burning barn, and the bruises on Willa's wrist all converging into a single white-hot point of fury, he meant it. The Colt was steady. His finger was on the trigger. And some dark part of him that had been born at Chickamauga and had never fully died was whispering that this was how problems got solved in a hard country by hard men. Behind the stable fence, hidden in the shadow of a water trough, James Yates watched his father hold a gun to a man's throat. The boy's eyes were huge. His mouth was open. He was not breathing. He had followed his father out of concern, because Pa had looked wrong this morning. Had looked the way he looked the night he came home from the saloon with blood on his hands. And James was 8 years old and trying to be the man of the house, and he was terrified. Not of Cobb. Of his father. Sheriff Morrison arrived on horseback 4 minutes later, alerted by one of Briggs's ranch hands who had seen Kendrick ride in armed and angry. Morrison dismounted heavily and walked into the stable yard with his hands visible and his voice pitched to calm. "Kendrick, put the gun down. This is not the way. He killed my cattle, Tom. He burned my barn. I have proof. Then we handle it through the law. Not like this. Not with a bullet in a man's throat. Put the gun down, Kendrick. Think about your children." The word children did what nothing else could. It cut through the rage like cold water on a fever. Kendrick's hand trembled. The colt wavered. Then he lowered it and stepped back, and Cobb slid away along the stable wall and spat at Kendrick's feet and walked off without a word. Morrison took the gun. Kendrick stood there breathing hard, the fury draining out of him and leaving something worse in its place. Shame. The sick, hollow feeling of a man who has looked into a mirror and seen something he did not recognize. Then he turned and saw James. The boy stood by the fence with his hands at his sides and his face white. When Kendrick took a step toward him, James stepped back. One step. Small, involuntary. The instinctive recoil of a child who has just seen his father become someone terrifying. The same recoil Willa made when she smelled whiskey. The same flinch. The same fear. Kendrick stopped. The world stopped. And in the silence between a father and a son who were staring at each other across an unbridgeable distance, something broke that would take more than words to mend. They rode home in silence. James on his pony, Kendrick on his horse. 20 feet of desert air between them that felt like 20 miles. At the ranch, James dismounted without a word and disappeared into the barn. Kendrick found him there an hour later, sitting with his back against the wall, carving a piece of wood with the small knife Willa had given him, pretending nothing had happened. Kendrick sat down beside him. The barn smelled of ash and char, and the cold winter air that whistled through the gaps where the east wall used to be. He sat and said nothing for a long time. And James said nothing, and the only sound was the soft whisper of the knife against wood. Then Kendrick spoke. James, what I did today was wrong. James did not look up. The knife kept moving. A man does not solve his problems by putting a gun in another man's face. Your mother would be ashamed of me, and she would be right. I lost my temper and I let anger make my decisions, and that is not the kind of man I want to be. It is not the kind of man I want you to be. Were you going to kill him, Pa? The question was quiet, steady. An 8-year-old boy asking his father the hardest question either of them had ever faced. I do not know, Kendrick said, and that is what scares me. James was quiet for a long time. Then, still not looking up, still carving, he said, Mrs. Osborne says being strong is not about hitting. It is about knowing when not to. Kendrick closed his eyes. His 8-year-old son, quoting the woman Kendrick loved, teaching him a lesson he should have already known. Out of the mouths of babes, Sarah used to say. She is right, Kendrick said. She is right, and I was wrong. I am sorry you saw that, James. I am sorry I gave you reason to be afraid of me. James finally looked up. His eyes were wet, but his jaw was set in a way that was so much like Kendrick's own that it hurt to see. Are you going to be like that again? No, Kendrick said, and he meant it the way he had meant the oath at Chickamauga, with everything he had. No, son, I am not. That evening, Kendrick found Willa in the kitchen. He told her what he had done, all of it. The gun, the fury, James watching. The boy stepping back. He did not soften it or excuse it. He laid it out bare, the way she had laid out her own past 2 nights ago behind the barn. I nearly became the kind of man you ran from, he said. I need you to know that, because you deserve the truth. Willa looked at him for a long moment. The lamplight caught the planes of her face and the steady gray-green of her eyes. She did not flinch. She did not look away. The difference between you and Edward, she said carefully, is that you stopped. Edward never stopped. Not once in 5 years. It was not absolution. It was distinction. And for now, it was enough. Later that evening, while Kendrick was sitting with the children, Willa was cleaning the sewing room. Moving the small bed to sweep underneath, she noticed something wedged between the wall and the window frame. A folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, that had been hidden or perhaps just forgotten in the narrow gap where the wood did not quite meet. She pulled it free. It was a letter in a woman's handwriting, delicate and slanted, the kind of penmanship that spoke of education and care. It was addressed to Kendrick. It was dated 3 weeks before Sarah Yates had died. Willa brought it to him unopened. She set it on the table in front of him and said, "I found this behind the window frame in my room. It is addressed to you, in a woman's handwriting." Kendrick looked at the paper. He recognized the handwriting immediately. His hands began to shake. He read it alone after Willa had left the room. He read it by lamplight in the kitchen where he and Sarah had shared 1,000 meals and 1,000 conversations, and all the ordinary, extraordinary moments of a marriage. The letter said, "My darling, if you are reading this, then I did not make it through. I knew the risk when we decided to try again, and I wanted you to know that I chose this. Do not blame yourself. Do not blame the baby. You wanted this child because your heart is big enough for a dozen children, and that is one of the reasons I love you. Please, Kendrick, do not bury yourself with me. The children need a father who is alive, truly alive, not just breathing. Find someone to help you, and if you find someone to love, love her. I give you permission. I give you my blessing. Do not carry me like a chain. Carry me like a candle. Your Sarah." Kendrick broke. He put his head on the table and wept. Not the silent, strangled grief he had carried for 15 months, pressing it down whenever it tried to surface, swallowing it like bile. This was the real thing. Deep, racking sobs that shook his whole body, that came from the place where he had locked away the guilt and the loss, and the terrible belief that he had killed his wife by loving her too much. Sarah knew. She had known the risk and she had chosen it. She had forgiven him before he even needed forgiving. She had written him permission to live, to love, to let her go. She had reached past death and set him free. He wept until there was nothing left. Then he sat in the quiet kitchen with Sarah's letter pressed against his chest and felt something change inside him. Not healed, not whole, but lighter. As if a weight he had been carrying so long that he had forgotten it was there had finally been set down. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket over his heart. Then he walked to the kitchen doorway where Willa was washing dishes with her burned hand, and he said, "I need to tell you something about my wife. And I need to tell you something about us." Kendrick shared Sarah's letter with Willa by the kitchen stove, and when she finished reading it, she pressed the paper to her chest and wept. Not for Sarah, whom she had never met, but for the kind of love that could reach past death and still set someone free. They sat at the kitchen table in the amber lamplight and talked. Really talked. Not the careful, circling conversations they had been having for weeks, where important things hid beneath ordinary words, and the silence between sentences carried more weight than the sentences themselves. This was something different. This was two people laying their wounds on the table and saying, "Here, look, this is what I am carrying." Kendrick told her about the guilt, how he had wanted another baby so badly that he had convinced Sarah to try again even though she was tired, even though 6 children was enough, even though some part of him knew the risk. How the midwife had looked at him as Sarah bled and he had seen it in her eyes, the accusation he had been screaming at himself ever since. "You did this." And now Sarah's letter telling him the opposite, telling him she chose it, telling him to live. Willa told him about Edward, the full picture this time. Not just the drinking and the hitting, but the system of it, the way a violent marriage becomes its own ecosystem. The good days that kept you hoping. The bad days that taught you to read the air in a room the way a sailor reads the sky. The night he came home so drunk he could barely stand, and she thought, "This is the night he kills me." And she had lain in bed afterward with the taste of blood in her mouth, and made a plan to leave, and then had not left, and had not left, and had not left, until Edward's own body did what she could not and freed her through pneumonia and liver failure. She told him about the lies she had told, the bruises she had hidden, the scars she carried under her clothes that mapped 5 years of love that was not love at all, but possession. She told him about leaving Kansas with a forged letter of reference and a newspaper clipping that called her a suspect, and a vial of laudanum she kept for emergencies that she had never quite defined. They were not lovers. They were not even in that moment a man and a woman falling in love. They were two people sitting in a kitchen in the middle of the Arizona desert, showing each other their worst scars and choosing not to look away. Trust, real trust, established for the first time between them. The blow came 2 days later. Sheriff Morrison rode out to the ranch in the middle of the morning, which was unusual enough to make Kendrick walk out to meet him with his heart already hammering. Morrison dismounted slowly like a man carrying a weight he would rather put down. "Briggs has filed a formal petition with the Cochise County Territorial Court," Morrison said without preamble. "He is requesting an investigation into you for child neglect and a review of your fitness to retain guardianship of your children. A judge is being sent from Tucson. He should arrive within the week." Kendrick felt the ground shift beneath him. On what grounds? Morrison pulled a folded paper from his coat and handed it over. Kendrick read it with Willa standing beside him, her face going white line by line. The petition alleged that Kendrick Yates was unable to provide adequate care for his 6 minor children, that his ranch was failing, that his livestock was dying of disease, that he had been involved in multiple violent incidents in town, and that a woman of questionable character, one Willa Osborne, was residing in the home with the children in an arrangement that was, the document noted delicately, unregulated and unsupervised. There was more. A separate affidavit, submitted by one Caleb Osborne of Lawrence, Kansas, alleged that Willa Osborne was suspected of murdering her husband through poisoning and had fled the state to avoid investigation. Kendrick looked at Morrison. "This is Briggs. All of it. He is using the courts to take my land." Morrison did not deny it. "Briggs is not using guns, Kendrick. He is using the law. And right now, the law is on his side." After Morrison left, Kendrick turned to Willa to tell her what the petition said. But he did not need to. She had read every word over his shoulder. She did not cry, she did not scream. She did something that frightened Kendrick more than either of those things would have. She went calm, terrifyingly, completely calm. The kind of calm that comes from a lifetime of practice. The calm of a woman who has learned that when the world catches fire around you, the only thing to do is move efficiently and without emotion toward the nearest exit. She walked to her room. She pulled her trunk from under the bed. She opened it and began to pack. Kendrick followed her. "What are you doing?" "If I leave," she said, folding a dress with mechanical precision, "Briggs has no weapon to use against you. The murder accusation goes away. The improper household claim weakens. Your children are safe." She looked at him, and her eyes were clear and dry and absolutely certain. "This is what I do, Kendrick. When I bring trouble, I remove myself. It is the only way I know to protect the people I care about." She was not being dramatic. She was not testing him. She was doing the math of survival the way she had always done it, adding up the costs and the risks, and concluding that her absence was worth more than her presence. She had protected herself this way in Kansas. She had protected Edward's other victims this way, the friends and neighbors who might have been hurt if she had fought back publicly. She had learned that the kindest thing she could do was disappear. Kendrick moved to the doorway. He did not lunge, he did not grab. He stood in the frame with his hands open, palms out, fingers spread, and he said one word, "No." Then more words, steady and sure. "You do not run. Not from this, not from us. We will fight this together, Willa. I am not letting you disappear into the night like you do not matter, because you matter. You matter to me, and you matter to these children, and this is your home. And I will be damned if I let Harlan Briggs or Caleb Osborne or anyone else take you from it." Willa looked at him, standing in the doorway. A big man blocking her exit. Every instinct she had learned in 5 years of marriage screamed at her to duck, to dodge, to find another way out. Men in doorways meant danger. Men who would not let you leave meant pain. But his hands were open, his voice was steady. His eyes held no anger, only a fierce, desperate determination that looked nothing like Edward, and everything like something she had stopped believing existed. A sound from the hallway made them both turn. Rebecca stood there in her nightgown, her dark eyes wide, her face pale. She had heard everything. She ran past Kendrick and threw her arms around Willa, and held on with a strength that seemed impossible for a 10-year-old body. "You promised," Rebecca said. Her voice was muffled against Willa's dress. "You do not get to leave. You promised." The twins appeared behind her, Martha clutching Michael's hand. James stood in the hallway with his arms crossed and his chin up, looking exactly like his father in the best possible way. Thomas came toddling from the front room and attached himself to Willa's leg like a barnacle. And Molly, 2 years old and understanding nothing except that everyone seemed upset, crawled to Willa's feet and raised her arms and said the only word she seemed to consider necessary: "Up." Willa looked at them. 6 children and a man who refused to let her disappear. A family holding her in place not with force, but with need, with love, with the simple and terrifying insistence that she belonged here. She put down the trunk. "All right," she said. Her voice shook, but her jaw was set. "We fight." Then she told Kendrick about the letters, the ones she had written weeks ago, the night Caleb first appeared, the letters to Dr. Samuel Phelps in Kansas and to the Shawnee County Records Office. The letters requesting proof that Edward died of natural causes and documentation of the insurance policy. "I did not sit still, Kendrick. I wrote to Dr. Phelps, the physician who treated Edward. He knows the truth. I also wrote to the county records office for the insurance documents. I do not know if the replies will arrive in time, but I did everything I could." Kendrick stared at her. "You planned for this. I have been planning my survival since I was 25 years old. It is what I do." He pulled her into his arms. Not a kiss, not yet. Just an embrace, his chin resting on her hair, her fists gripping the back of his shirt. The children pressed in around them, a tangle of small bodies and reaching hands, and for a moment the whole family stood in the sewing room in a knot of arms and need, and something that felt like the beginning of hope. "Then we planned together," Kendrick said into her hair. "From now on, no more running alone." Kendrick Yates had 1 week before the judge arrived. 1 week to save the ranch, save Willa, and save his family. He started by doing the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. He asked for help. He saddled his horse the next morning and rode to every neighboring ranch in the Sulphur Springs Valley, hat in hand. Pride swallowed. He told the truth, all of it, to anyone who would listen. He told them about the dead cattle and the knife marks, about the fire and the brass button, about Briggs's petition and the judge from Tucson. He did not embellish, and he did not beg. He simply laid out the facts and asked if they would stand with him. Some said no. A rancher named Cartwright shut the door in his face. The Miller family listened, and then looked at their feet and said they could not afford to cross Briggs. Kendrick did not blame them. Fear was a currency Briggs had been circulating for years, and not everyone had the reserves to spend against it. But 3 said yes. Old Hector Villarreal, who ran a small herd on the west end of the valley and had been losing cattle to mysterious causes for 2 years, looked at Kendrick with dark eyes full of anger that had been simmering quietly for a long time. He said, "It is about time someone stood up. I am with you." The Dawson family, a husband and wife and 3 grown sons who ranched the North Basin, listened to Kendrick's story and exchanged glances that spoke of conversations they had been having in private for months. "We have been waiting for someone to go first," Ben Dawson said. "Consider us second." And Clara Whitfield, a young widow who ran 40 head on the East Ridge by herself, with no hands and no help, and a backbone made of something harder than the desert rock her ranch was built on. She listened to Kendrick with her arms crossed and her eyes sharp. And then she said, "Briggs tried to buy my land 6 months after my husband died. Used the same playbook. Dead stock, credit trouble, friendly offers that were not friendly. I told him to go to hell then, and I will tell a judge the same thing now." While Kendrick built his alliance, Willa built her defense. She put on her best dress and walked into Wilcox and knocked on the door of the Patterson boarding house. "Mrs." Patterson opened it with surprise and a fair amount of curiosity. "I need your help," Willa said. And she told Adelaide Patterson everything. Not the version she had been telling. The real version. Edward. The beatings, Kansas, Caleb, the accusation, the judge coming. Mrs. Patterson listened in silence. Her face went through shock and anger, and something that might have been self-recrimination, because she was a woman who prided herself on reading people, and she had not read this. When Willa finished, the older woman was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Osborne, I watched you turn those Yates children from a pack of wild creatures into proper, cared-for young ones. I watched you teach that boy James to smile again. I watched you hold that baby like she was your own. I will say that to the judge. I will say it to God. I will say it to anyone who asks." The night before the hearing, Morrison came to the ranch after dark. He rode up quiet, like a man who did not want to be seen, and he carried a leather folder under his arm. Inside the folder was everything he had been collecting for months, reports he had filed about dead livestock, notes on property damage, statements from neighbors who had reported suspicious activity, and the piece that mattered most, a receipt he had lifted from behind the bar at the Silver Strike Saloon, written in Briggs's own hand, showing a payment of $50 to Silas Cobb, dated 1 week before the barn fire. Morrison set the folder on the kitchen table and looked at Kendrick with the expression of a man who has been carrying a weight too long and is finally setting it down. "I am a coward, Kendrick. I have known about Briggs for years, and I have done nothing because I was afraid. Afraid of losing my badge, afraid of what he could do to this town. But I am not a bad man. At least I hope I am not. And I cannot sit by and watch him destroy your family. I hope this helps. I hope." "It helps," Kendrick said. "More than you know." Morrison nodded and left as quietly as he had come. And Kendrick stood in the doorway and watched him ride into the dark, and thought about courage and cowardice, and how the line between them was sometimes thinner than a piece of paper. That night, the children asleep, the house quiet, Kendrick and Willa sat on the front porch. The stars over the Chiricahuas were thick and bright, the kind of sky that only exists in places where there are no city lights to dim them. The air smelled of sage and wood smoke, and the particular sweetness of desert winter. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Kendrick said, "I love you, Willa." She turned to look at him. "I should have said it a long time ago. Not because you're good with the children, though Lord knows you are. Not because you saved this ranch from burning down. Because you walked into a disaster and chose to stay. Because you showed me that strength does not look like a fist. Because when I look at you, I see the rest of my life, and for the first time since Sarah died, that does not scare me." Willa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I knew at Christmas. The night you cried in front of me over the letter. I thought, any man brave enough to weep in front of a stranger is strong enough for me to trust. I have been afraid my whole life, Kendrick. Afraid of men, afraid of love, afraid it would always end in pain. But I am not afraid of you. I am not afraid of this." He leaned toward her and she did not pull away. His hand came up to her jaw, open-palmed, gentle, his calloused fingers against her skin. Her hand found his chest, resting over his heart, over the pocket where Sarah's letter still lay folded. They kissed, not rushed, not perfect. His lips chapped from the desert wind, hers tasting of the coffee they had shared. A kiss that held all the tenderness and terror and hope of two people who had learned the hard way what love could cost and were choosing to risk it anyway. When they drew apart, Willa smiled. It was the first real, unguarded smile Kendrick had seen from her, and it changed her whole face, made her beautiful, made her radiant. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, echoing his words back to him, "we face it together." At dawn, a column of dust rose on the Benson Road, the judge's carriage flanked by 2 lawyers and a court clerk, and behind them, riding hard to catch up, 2 men that Willa recognized from Lawrence, Kansas. The past had arrived, and it would not wait. The makeshift courtroom in the Wilcox Community Church smelled of candle wax and old hymnals. And when Judge Walter Henley called the proceedings to order, Willa realized that everything she had spent a year running from was now seated 12 feet away. Caleb Osborne sat in the second row with his hat on his knee and his charming smile fixed in place. Beside him sat a man Willa recognized as Lester Barnes, a neighbor from Lawrence who had never liked her and had always been too friendly with the Osborne family. They were the Kansas contingent. They had come for blood. Harlan Briggs sat on the other side of the aisle with his lawyer, a sharp-featured man from Tucson named Whitmore, who wore a city suit and had the predatory alertness of someone who got paid by the argument. Briggs himself was calm, composed, the picture of a concerned community member who had filed this petition only out of regard for the welfare of the children. Kendrick sat at the front with Willa beside him. His hands rested on his thighs, and when the proceedings began and the first accusations were read aloud, those hands clenched into fists. Then, deliberately, consciously, he opened them, spread his fingers, laid his palms flat. He had learned. Whitmore presented Briggs's case with the smooth efficiency of a man who had done this before. Kendrick Yates was an unfit father. His ranch was failing. His livestock was dying. He had been involved in violent altercations in town. And the woman residing in his home, one Willa Osborne, was a person of deeply questionable character who was suspected of poisoning her late husband in Kansas. He called Caleb Osborne to testify. Caleb took the stand with the ease of a man who had rehearsed his lines. He described Willa as unstable and secretive. He described Edward's death as sudden and suspicious. He produced Lester Barnes, who testified that he had seen Willa buying unusual herbs at the Lawrence apothecary in the weeks before Edward died. The courtroom murmured. Judge Henley, a stern-faced man in his 60s with a reputation for fairness and a low tolerance for nonsense, watched with sharp eyes that gave nothing away. Then the counterattack began. Sheriff Morrison stood. He was sweating through his shirt and his voice shook, but he stood. And that was what mattered. He opened the leather folder and presented every document inside. Reports on dead livestock, the brass button from Silas Cobb's coat, recovered from the fire debris, and the receipt in Briggs's handwriting showing payment to Cobb 1 week before the barn fire. Your Honor, Morrison said, Harlan Briggs has been conducting a deliberate campaign of sabotage against the Yates Ranch. Dead cattle, poisoned water, arson. I have documented every incident, and I have evidence linking his hired man Silas Cobb directly to the barn fire. This petition is not about the welfare of children. It is about the theft of land. The courtroom erupted. Judge Henley gavelled for silence. Whitmore objected loudly. Briggs's face, for the first time in anyone's memory, lost its composure. Mrs. Adelaide Patterson took the stand next. She described in detail the transformation of the Yates children since Willa's arrival. She described Willa's skill and kindness and patience. She described the clean clothes and regular meals and the sound of children laughing that had not been heard from that ranch in months. The 3 neighboring ranchers testified one after another. Hector Villarreal described losing cattle to the same mysterious methods. Ben Dawson described Briggs's pattern of intimidation and coercion. Clara Whitfield described how Briggs had tried to buy her land using the same playbook after her husband died. The concerned offers, the financial pressure, the slow squeeze. And then the doors of the church opened. Rebecca Yates, 11 years old, burst through them like a small whirlwind, clutching a thick envelope that the mail rider had just delivered. She had been watching for him all morning from the church steps, because Willa had told her what to look for, and Rebecca had appointed herself the lookout with the same fierce determination she had once used to fight against Willa's presence, and now used to fight for it. She ran the envelope to Willa. Willa's hands shook as she opened it. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a signed deposition from Dr. Samuel Phelps of Lawrence, Kansas, stating that he had attended Edward Osborne during his final illness, and that the cause of death was pneumonia complicated by chronic alcoholism and liver disease. In his professional medical opinion, there was absolutely no evidence of poisoning of any kind. The second was a certified copy of Edward Osborne's death certificate from the Shawnee County Records Office, confirming the same. The third was something Willa had not expected. A personal letter from Dr. Phelps, written in a careful hand, stating that he had treated Willa Osborne on multiple occasions over a period of 5 years for injuries including bruised ribs, a fractured wrist, facial contusions, and various other trauma. That in his professional opinion, these injuries were consistent with sustained domestic violence, and that Willa Osborne was, in his words, a woman of remarkable courage who survived what would have broken most people, and who deserves to be remembered as a victim and a survivor, not as a suspect. Willa handed the documents to Judge Henley. He read them in silence while the courtroom held its breath. Then he looked at Caleb Osborne, and his expression was the cold, controlled fury of a man who has devoted his career to justice and does not take kindly to having it perverted. Caleb tried to bluster. "Your Honor, those documents do not prove—" "Sit down, Mr. Osborne." Caleb sat. Judge Henley removed his spectacles and addressed the courtroom. "The petition alleging child neglect against Kendrick Yates is dismissed. There is no evidence of neglect. There is, on the contrary, substantial evidence that Mr. Yates has made extraordinary efforts to care for his children under extremely difficult circumstances, including the hiring of a competent and caring housekeeper who has, by all testimony, transformed the welfare of those children." He turned to the matter of Willa. "The allegation against Mrs. Willa Osborne is dismissed with prejudice. The medical evidence is clear and unambiguous. Edward Osborne died of natural causes. The accusation of poisoning is baseless and appears to have been made in bad faith for the purpose of intimidation and financial coercion." He looked at Caleb. "Mr. Osborne, you are ordered to leave Cochise County within 48 hours. If you return, you will be arrested for filing a fraudulent affidavit with this court." He looked at Briggs. "Mr. Briggs, the evidence presented today raises serious questions about your conduct. I am referring this matter to the Territorial Marshal for investigation into possible charges of conspiracy, destruction of property, and interference with justice." Then, the final hammer. Silas Cobb is to be arrested immediately and remanded to the Cochise County Jail to await trial on charges of arson, destruction of livestock, and criminal trespass. Briggs stood. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear. Briggs looked around the courtroom at the faces of the people he had controlled and intimidated for years, and for the first time he saw something other than deference or fear. He saw contempt. He saw the quiet, devastating judgment of a community that had finally seen behind the mask. He walked out of the church with his back straight and his chin up, but he walked alone, and the gallery watched him go in silence. And his empire of intimidation, built over 20 years of patient, ruthless accumulation, crumbled in the time it took to cross a room. Outside the church, the winter sun hung low over the valley. Kendrick stood on the steps with Willa beside him and his 6 children around him, and he breathed. Just breathed. In and out. The air tasted like freedom. On the road home, the wagon rattled over the desert hardpan. The children sat in the back, exhausted and jubilant. James had his arm around Martha. Michael held Molly on his lap. Thomas slept against Rebecca's shoulder with his thumb in his mouth. The twins were arguing about whose turn it was to sit by the tailgate, which meant everything was back to normal. Kendrick stopped the wagon on the ridge overlooking the ranch. Late afternoon light gilded the valley in gold. Sulphur Springs Creek glinted like a thread of silver. The half-rebuilt barn cast a long shadow. The garden Willa had planted was a patch of dark, turned earth waiting for spring. Smoke curled from the chimney where she had banked the stove that morning. "Willa," he said, "I want to ask you something. And this time I am going to do it right." He climbed down from the wagon. He dropped to one knee in the red Arizona dust. He took off his hat. "Willa Osborne, will you marry me? Not because my children need a mother, though God knows they do. Not because I need a partner on the ranch, though I surely do. Not because we are convenient for each other. But because I love you. I love your strength and your scars and the way you fight for the people you care about. I love that you wrote those letters to Kansas when you could have just run. I love that you stayed when everything told you to go. I want you to be my wife, my partner, my family. For as long as this desert has sun, 6 children leaned over the wagon rail, holding their breath. Willa looked down at him. This man kneeling in the dirt with his hat in his hands and his heart wide open. Sunburned, calloused, imperfect. A man who had nearly broken and had chosen instead to bend. Who had learned to open his hands instead of closing them. Who had stood in a doorway not to trap her, but to keep her. Who had let her save herself and loved her more for it. She thought about Edward, about Kansas, about the running and the hiding and the years of believing she was unworthy of anything better than what she had. And then she thought about this ranch and these children and this man. And she knew with a certainty that went deeper than thought, deeper than fear, all the way down to bone, that this was where she was meant to be. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Kendrick." The children erupted. Martha and Michael leaped from the wagon and nearly knocked their father over. Thomas woke up and yelled, "What happened?" James climbed down and shook his father's hand with a solemnity that made Kendrick's eyes sting. Rebecca smiled, a real smile, full and bright and unguarded. And Molly reached for Willa from Michael's arms and said, "Clear as a bell, Mama." It was the first time. The first time Molly had called anyone that since she was old enough to form the word. Willa caught her and held her and buried her face in the baby's hair and let the tears come. Happy tears, the kind she had forgotten how to cry. 6 months later, on a warm spring afternoon, the Wilcox Community Church was decorated with wildflowers and paper lanterns, and the particular festive chaos that accompanies a wedding where half the town has decided to attend. Reverend Collins stood at the altar. The pews were packed. Rebecca, now 11, stood near the refreshment table in a blue dress that Willa had sewn for her. She watched her father lead Willa down the aisle. Willa wore a simple dress of ivory cotton that she and Mrs. Patterson had made together, and she carried a bouquet of desert marigolds and sage blossoms, and she was smiling. Kendrick wore his best shirt and his clean boots, and the expression of a man who cannot believe his own good fortune. When the Reverend asked if he would take this woman, he said, "I will, so fast." The congregation laughed. When Willa said her vows, her voice was steady and sure. "I, Willa, take you, Kendrick, to be my husband. I came to your home, broken and lost, and you gave me a family and a purpose and a love I thought I would never find again. I promise to stand by your side through every season, to love you through every storm, to be your partner all the days of my life." Rings exchanged. A kiss that lasted longer than strictly appropriate for a church, which made the children groan and the adults applaud. Afterward, there was food and fiddle music and dancing under the paper lanterns. Kendrick waltzed with Willa in the churchyard, while the stars came out one by one over the Chiricahuas. His hand rested on the small of her back, open-palmed, gentle. Her head was on his shoulder. They moved slowly, not quite in time with the music, but perfectly in time with each other. Rebecca watched them from the refreshment table. She reached into the pocket of her blue dress and felt the handkerchief there. The one Willa had made from a piece of Sarah's dress, with her mother's initials embroidered in blue thread. S.Y. She rubbed the fabric between her fingers and felt the stitches Willa had made, neat and careful, holding the old cloth together with new thread. After the dancing, when no one was watching, Rebecca slipped away. She walked up the gentle slope behind the church to the small cemetery on the hill. The graves were marked with wooden crosses and a few stone markers. She found her mother's and knelt beside it. "Hi, Mama," she said. "I brought someone to meet you." She placed a flower from her bouquet on the stone, a desert marigold, bright yellow against the pale dust. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Willa stood there in her wedding dress with the evening light behind her, holding a single flower of her own. She had followed Rebecca without being asked, because she understood what the girl needed, even when the girl herself did not. Willa knelt beside Rebecca and placed her flower next to the first. Quietly, so only Rebecca and the wind could hear, she said, "Thank you for loving them before me. I promise I will take care of them, all of them." for as long as I have breath. Two flowers side by side on Sarah Yates's grave. One from her daughter, one from the woman who would love her family now. Rebecca took Willa's hand. They stayed like that for a moment, two figures on a hillside in the fading light. Then they stood, and Rebecca squeezed Willa's hand, and Willa squeezed back. They turned and walked down the hill together, toward the music, toward the lanterns, toward the family waiting for them. Rebecca walked between the cemetery and the celebration, between the mother she had lost and the mother she had found, and she thought, "This is my family. Not perfect, not unbroken, but whole in all the ways that matter." She broke into a run. The desert wind carried the sound of her laughter across the valley, mixing with the fiddle music and the shouts of her brothers and sisters, and the low, steady voice of her father calling her name. Behind her, on the hillside, two flowers lay together on a quiet grave. One from a daughter, one from a woman who would love this family until her last breath. The sun dropped behind the Chiricahuas, painting the desert in gold, and the evening star appeared alone in the fading sky, bright and unwavering, like a promise kept. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.